Good evening and welcome to today's Engaged lecture. I am Trinidad Vico, I'm the director of the Heritage Conservation Programs here at USC, obviously. The Spring 2023 lecture series is presented with generous support from the USC Thomas J. Bragg and Jin D. Wong FAIA Annual Lectures Fund. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Paul Farber. As director and co-founder of Monument Lab, Paul Farber is among the nation's thought leaders on monuments, memory, and public space. Farber is the author and co-editor of several books, including A Wall of Our Own, An American History of the Berlin Wall, Monument Lab, Creative Speculations from Philadelphia, and the National Monument Audit. Farber is also the host and creator of The Statue, a podcast series with WHYY NPR. He serves as senior research scholar at the Center for Public Art and Space at the University of Pennsylvania and holds a PhD from the University of Michigan in American culture. Welcome, Paul.
Good evening. Okay, it's great to be here. Thank you so much. I want to first just give a lot of gratitude to the School of Architecture and all of the partners who brought me here, and especially to Trinidad Rico for the kind introduction, and Kirsten Peterson Johansson, Keiko McNally, and Courtney Brubaker for helping get through. I am not standing up right now because today I've received a gift of a compression boot. I went out for a run on the campus this morning, as I like to do if I go to a new place. And you may have known that yesterday was the full moon. And this morning, if you were out early, it was beautiful. And so I noticed how beautiful it was at the very moment that I had a bad step and then fell onto the track, and here I am. So please bear with me as I go through, but doing okay and didn't want to miss the opportunity to be here. And before I begin, I just want to say, for many of you meeting for the first time, those here in the room, those online, but really grateful to be joined by a few special people. My brother Ivan came down from Washington and happens to be here. And then you'll hear some special shout outs, but especially to Yoel Garcia, the Land Under the Plinth team. You'll be hearing more about his work and his collaborators. It's really great to see you. I'm going to be sharing the work of Monument Lab. I'm going to be talking about our National Monument Audit, our regeneration project, and then close with some stories from a new project that I've been working on, a podcast series for NPR, and just learning about how to get into the question of narrative change around monuments. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today has to do with a premise that Monument Lab has kind of come forward with, our vision statement: monuments must change. It's a refrain you'll hear. And to really dig into the idea that there is no one definition of monument. That is one of the reasons that we find ourselves in a predicament around monuments, and looking to those who have found ways to innovate the form, reckon with the form, thinking about it in its multifarious ways and multivocal ways may be an important insight into how we move forward. Just to take a step back, Monument Lab began as a classroom project. Myself and Ken Lum were teaching classes 10 years ago at the University of Pennsylvania. I had grown up in Philadelphia, left for about 10 years. I lived in Southern California, Michigan, Washington, DC, and Berlin, Germany. And I came back to my hometown after writing a dissertation about American artists in the Berlin Wall. As a queer Jewish person, when I grew up, I was not told to go to Germany. Sometimes you're told not to do something, you do it anyway. And I found things I wasn't looking for when I spent time in Germany. I found monuments and memorials as big as a city block, others as small as cobblestone, And while there was clearly a heavy burden of history in Germany, I found numerous technologies of memory. And it felt a relief to not have to push under the rug, so to speak, the tough parts of history, but instead to take it on in ways that lived in monuments and memorials, lived in school curricula, lived as reparations programs. The idea of memory culture felt like not only something that I found healing, but was instructive in thinking back in the US. Monument Lab began in the classroom. We spilled out to be a passion project. And this was our first project in the City Hall Philadelphia courtyard in 2015. And really at the core of what we were doing is working with artists to build prototype monuments. All monuments are really prototypes. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But to do so, not because they had to be there forever or there to speak to some kind of universal collective idea, but actually to take on some of the biggest challenges. And in this case, the late artist Terry Adkins, the idea was to build a monument to public education, both to the great educational innovations in our city, but also to closed public schools disproportionately impacting communities of color in the city. To do so with a sculpture that was critical, but inviting, that was modeled after the first school where teachers were trained to teach. That was a part of Philadelphia's history. Other prototype monuments for us included work like this one from the artist Karen Olivier, covering a Revolutionary War monument in a mirror. We asked how monuments reflect us and our values. Well, she wanted to make that literal in a park that commemorated a loss in the Revolutionary War, and wanted to bring it to life, the kind of monument that is not in the headlines, but the kind of one that you'd walk by every day and not notice, and wanted to bring it to life in powerful ways. Sharon Hayes' If They Should Ask, noting that in the city of Philadelphia with nearly 1,000 monuments to historic men, there are 2 to women who actually lived. Joan of Arc, she's not from Philly, and Mary Dyer, a Bostonian Quaker woman. She said, well, what it would mean to take pedestals that have historic men on them around the city, scale them to half size so they're more human scale, and then work with an intergenerational, intersectional group of women, trans inclusive, to ask who could be honored. These are prototypes. They are not meant to be there forever. They're meant to be part of exhibitions, public installations, and projects to provoke and open up the idea that the monuments that we have don't tell the full story. Alongside them, we set up labs, sometimes in shipping containers, sometimes in libraries and museums. The idea that we theorize public space while in public space. Each of our projects has a question. It's not meant to have a question that has a single answer. That's not really for us how we knit together our civic infrastructure or fabric, but meant to have questions that open up possibilities, have a multitude of responses. And in certain cases, we've collected those responses, turned them into municipal data. In other times, we've created publications that we share with the city. We are, for the first about 8 years of our work, never asked to do this. Right? We always were kind of guided by this principle, thinking of the late poet, Black lesbian writer, Audre Lorde, to paraphrase, who said, the rumor that you can't take on City Hall was started by City Hall. When we started to do this work more and more, what we found was actually there was an eagerness in municipal sectors. Like, wait, actually, we haven't had the time to do R&D. What would happen if you open up, if we open up some of the conversations that we have had and hear those responses? And I think for us now, we're a nonprofit. We now have a team. For the first 8 years of the work, we had 0 employees, me included. We're a passion project, a group of artists and researchers and scholars. So while I'm here today representing, I want to give a shout out to the broader team of people based in Philadelphia, in New Orleans, and other cities around the country. We now are a public art and history studio and find ourselves in really fascinating conversations with federal partners, agencies, cities, municipalities, cultural organizations, but also still really at our core is art. And we work with artists and educators and grassroots organizers and aim to be a bridge and a hub in this field. Among that kind of work, which I'll talk a bit more about, our regeneration project. So in addition to prototype monuments, in addition to the kind of notions of participatory research, we've also started doing field building, which I'll talk more about. And I hope you see that the dot on the map, #1 here in LA, which I'll talk more about the Land Under the Plinth project. But just thinking about the fact that, you may have seen this, you may have asked it that, like, all right, what do we do? Our monuments, we know there's a conversation that's tough, that's painful, that's violent. How do we fix them? I often say there is no single answer. There are hyper-local, layered approaches that must be taken. At the same time, how do you build strategy, tactic, and coalition across locations? Those are questions that we have been asking ourselves and asking with our colleagues in the field. So thinking about, I've gone through a quick history here of how we've developed. One of the biggest moments for us where we went from passion project to being a studio came with the opening of the Mellon Foundation's Monuments Project, a $250 million investment into the field of building out a fuller story of our monuments and also building out a field of practitioners, people who would situate themselves in official and unofficial capacities, to imagine new monuments, to really rethink the form of them, to reckon with stories that have not yet been told. We were the inaugural grantees, and what we were asked to begin with was to do an audit of America's monuments. This is a project that you can get for free on our website. You can download the data, you can order a printed copy as well. And this is both one of the most rewarding and one of the most challenging projects that I've ever worked on. And it's been great to see it play out. We've given presentations to the Department of the Interior, to the National Park Service. I get calls from public art offices in other countries who say, wait, we actually are reading this and we have some questions for you that help us think in new ways. But what I want to be really clear about, while this has been a really fantastic project, it came out in the fall of 2021. If in your head, you're thinking, oh, an audit of monuments, it's kind of like going to Google Monuments. I could just type in I could figure out where all the monuments are. This is a very reasonable thought, right? I know where I could find them. I can tell who paid for them, what they mean, and maybe we can petition there to get toxic ones taken away or know more about them. And I will just tell you, that's the opposite of the case. You ever try to open up a drawer to get one wire, but it's where you keep all your wires, and then you pull and you pulled out the whole drawer, right? Imagine that on a giant scale. The monuments that we've inherited. So first of all, to say there is nothing that's inherently a monument. There are things we call monuments. There are things that we protect as monuments. But just even the very definition. When we did our audit, we gathered together over 500,000 records of historic properties and narrowed them down to a study set of close to 50,000, 48,178 to be precise. We couldn't find any of those data sources from federal, state, local, tribal, civic organizations have a single shared definition of monument. The only one, OpenStreetMaps, that came close, offered a definition and then said, please just double check this as well, because there's more to this story. When we say monument, we could very easily be talking about bronze and marble symbols on high. In this country, we're also talking about ecological sites, historic sites, ruins. You may know the notion of the unintentional monument, the shuttered school or factory or piece of civic infrastructure that wasn't meant to signify history, but ends up doing so. And of course, the idea of monumental sound, poetry, projection. You can't tell the story of Richmond, Virginia, for example, without the notions of the activists at Marcus David Peters Circle, formerly Lee Circle, that changed the story of Monument Avenue as we know it. In the absence of a single definition, in the absence of a single agency that's in charge of all of this, those who have had the time, the money, and the official power have disproportionately made a monument landscape in their image. Not only to reflect what they care about and refer to as monumental histories, but to do so to reinforce their power. And in the case of this history, whether that's related to the notions of instantiating racial apartheid after Reconstruction, periods of conquest of native lands, displacement within city environments, the things that end up being called monuments in a kind of grand and civic way reflect power in obvious and more subtle ways. The flip of that, though, is that if you don't have the time, the money, or the official power, you have power nonetheless. So you build your own monuments, or you gather around monuments that exist. And that's how you, in one way, make your presence felt. In Monument Lab's work, we've tried to come up with a working definition of monuments: a statement of power and presence in public. A statement of power and presence in public. That's a definition that has guided our work, brought us in public settings with our fellows, with our regen teams. It's poetic and open so that all of those different ways of monuments can live. And we actually hear from people in their own places how they view a monument. When it came to the audit, we would never finish that work if we didn't bound the category. So what we ended up doing is looking for a large enough study set of what we call conventional monuments. And we worked with a big team. This was co-directed by myself, Sue Mobley, Lori Allen, data artist Brian Fu. We built an algorithm to look through 500,000 records. There had never been a study like this. There have been other studies of sculpture through the Smithsonian, through studies of Confederate imagery through the Southern Poverty Law Center. But this study had never been done. This is not a map of everything that could ever be called a monument in this country, because that's actually impossible. If we don't agree on what a monument is, how would we actually settle that? Instead, this is a snapshot of how the monument landscape has been shaped, not just as one-off sites, but across generations, across time. It includes every US state, each territory, numerous tribal communities as well. And again, it's not going to give you a snapshot of everything that's there, but it's meant to tell us, well, what are the values and visions that have been shaped over time? Here are the key findings. I'll read them out loud. You can see them here. Before I do so, what I would just say is, as we read them, how do they compare with what you've experienced, what you already know? For some, these are findings that you could have known by sticking your head out anywhere you've grown up or been. Or you may have other nuances, but either way, take a thought and think about not just the one-off, but the collection. Monuments have always changed. The monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male. The most common features of American monuments reflect war and conquest, and the story of the United States as told by our current monuments misrepresents our history. In the audit publication, we write essays, we share things that we learned. You can also go in our study set and ask questions of that study set of 48,178. But these were guiding points. And I think what's really clear is we wanted this to be rigorous, to be able to present it in academic settings. We had advisors in and out of numerous fields related to monuments. But we also wanted to work hard to make it accessible, that it wouldn't be weighed down. If we put our time, money, and energy and capacity into trying to create an exhaustive study, if you all already know a lot of this stuff, we needed to move forward. One thing I want to say as I go forward is this idea that monuments, we're told, are permanent. There's nothing that's permanent, right? This piece of plastic will last longer than any monument likely you or I could create. Monuments require maintenance, money, and mindsets to keep them up. And part of the goal of the audit was to unpack that. So I'm going to just pick up on two of the themes. The monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male. You probably already knew that. Here is a composite of the top 50. You can read the names on our website. A few notes when you zoom out and you kind of look at the findings here. So of the top 50 figures who have monuments dedicated to them, which was our way of looking at the demographics, 11 were US presidents, 12 were US generals. We did not count people who just served in the Confederacy. They were not US generals. Landowners, 76% of that top 50 owned land. 40% were born into wealth. 50%, that's half, made claims of owning other people. And according to our standards today, 44 of the top 50 would be white men. So a note on that, there were more Confederates in the top 50 than Black Americans. There were no self-identified Asian Pacific Islander, US-born Latinx or LGBTQ plus people in the top 50. There were 3 women in the top 50. Joan of Arc was the most monumentalized woman in the United States, followed by Harriet Tubman and Sacagawea. And this gives us a sense, again, this is not just in one city, one place. This is what it looks like when you take a snapshot across the United States. Key finding, the story of the United States as told by our current monument and landscape misrepresents our history. We know that what gets put on a pedestal is a sliver of our history, right? But this, I have to say, I said like some of the findings, were things that you all may have known, we may have known, but this one blew us away. That if the study set of close to 6,000 mentions of the Civil War in records, 1% mentioned slavery. So because the audit was a gathering of data that already existed in federal, state, local, tribal, civic entities, we looked through records. And so a record means, in this case, that the word slavery showed up in the title of a monument, in the plaque's text, if someone had bothered to write it, or in the metadata, meaning that someone who's a local researcher took notes. It might not even be present on the site. That does not necessarily mean that the word is accounting for the stories of self-emancipated Black folks or the long legacy of slavery in our country. It just means the word is there 1% of the time. When it came to Confederate, 3% mentioned the word defeat. I can just tell you anecdotally, when I've traveled the country and seen Confederate lost cause monuments, you see words, not often defeat. I've seen words like loyal, patriot, statesman. Defeat, not there. The Civil War was undeniably fought over slavery, full stop. And then finally, when we looked through our study set and put in the term pioneer, we found that only in 15% of the cases did words Native American, Indian, or Indigenous show up. That does not count the pejorative terms in the data. And we know that over half of these pioneer monuments went in after the period of 1930, after prolonged bouts of violence and displacement of Native people from their lands. Look, it can be profoundly catalytic when a municipality or organizers or activists take away a toxic monument or build a new one. And I've seen that firsthand. It's really powerful. At the same time, when we're talking about the monuments we've inherited, it's not enough to complete our monuments if we do not reckon with our histories. These are some of the same conversations happening on a grand public scale, at the school board level, thinking about all of the work happening around the country in classrooms, and just thinking about what would it mean to actually reckon with our history in a way that was holistic. This is how we came to this idea of monuments must change. And I'll tell you, as we were kind of coming in to distill the findings from our audit, I will just tell you, we first had the phrase monuments change. We also had monuments are made to change. We say word nerding, getting the words right. And I'll say, like, we said monuments change kind of sounds like the phrase shit happens. Like, good luck, hope it works out, right? And I think we were like, well, what would not only push others, but ourselves? Monuments are always changing. There is no monument that is hermetically sealed, that is off, right? And if you even hear about places that have injunctions on monuments like moving, changing, they're preserved, right? If they're valued. So I think this idea that change is inherent, and that what if we imagined a monument landscape that was meant to call back to the past and look to the future? I spent a lot of time looking at this moment in time. And I know that I would say that we're in a period of reckoning and reimagining our monuments, our symbols, and our systems. But I also want to be clear that just like the idea of change, nothing happens without people doing that work. Every time you see a headline of monument removed in a city, there's hidden footnotes of the activists and organizers who spent a lot of time pushing a municipality to make that happen and will be there after the municipality loses steam and interest. But I'm fascinated by the idea of the empty pedestal, because the empty pedestal is this icon of our time. In some cities, they've been removed and disassembled. Here in Richmond, Virginia, this site already has been returned to grass with a kind of sense of what will come next. I was just in New Orleans this week. Here is a pedestal that climbs into the sky that used to have Robert E. Lee on top of it. I don't know if you can see it with, you can only barely see it here with the caption, but someone has where the plaque used to be, put a smiley face. I'm like, it's kind of, I don't know. I thought it was like a Mona Lisa. I was like, I'm not sure if I see a smile on that, but I'm going to take it. But I think that, here we are over 5 years since this monument has been taken down. And there have been art interventions, projections, thinking about the work of folks like Take 'Em Down NOLA or Co-Locates Paper Monuments. Simone Lee, the artist, had an installation here. There's still this question of what happens next. And I will tell you, if you think like, oh, there must be a grand plan out there, there's often not. Like the statues that have been removed, they might be in municipal side lots. There'll be a show here in LA through Lax Art and MoCA later this year, where they're going to assemble some of the statues that have been toppled around the country or removed. The pedestals, though, they're like civic infrastructure. I've seen them still have spotlights up to a ghost statue. In New Orleans, while this has that spotlight, there's another pedestal that's going to be repurposed for a sign for parking at the aquarium. Like there are scars hiding in plain sight. You can go to them and find traces. And so I'm really transfixed by them. I also want to note from the audit, what I learned is that for every empty pedestal out there, there's at least 99 that are still standing. That despite consternation about the change in our monument landscape, it's largely been kept the same since before 2020, before the removals of 2017 and 2018. So what do you do in the face of that? One place to think about this through the eyes of people doing this work on the ground is here in LA. And as I noted, we are joined here by members of the Plinth team, Yoel Garcia, here, a former Monument Lab fellow, and thinking about in the city the toppling of statues to Juniper Serra, and this question of what comes next. And I want to kind of highlight this because in one case, the story of the empty pedestal here is not frozen in time, not stuck in a what do we do, but actually entangled, embroiled in the most powerful ways from my standpoint and my colleagues in what will come next. Land Under the Plinth, which I will only do some justice to, and hopefully you get to follow their work on Instagram or maybe talk to Yoel and others here, is a project that seeks to take the land on which colonial monuments once stood here in LA and in part, I would say, work with the city and push the city for a cultural easement for the Tongva people, the first peoples of what is now called Los Angeles, for a cultural center, new signage, and to really retake that idea of that land and really think about the context around the pedestal. This project is part of a nationwide effort that Monument Lab has been curating and collaborating on. Here you see another team member, Mercedes Dorame, and leaders from all over the country. We gathered last year in Washington, DC, and really, again, this like value of what do we do with our monuments? Well, one of the things we can do is, while it's helpful to have a study, it'd be much better to just actually go to people doing this work already, hear from them, think about what they need, and really help listen to and build coalitions. And just thinking about this project, we thought of it as a public art project and a public history project, but I have to say, exhibition really isn't feeling like the right term. Like, this is a group of people who've been meeting monthly for over a year. I've been working on campaigns in local contexts. And some of those teams are building things that look like monuments. Some of them have said, nope, the land is our monument. Instead, we want to build walkways, new maps, convene intergenerational groups. And really all of these, while these teams are partnering with certain municipal entities and federal agencies, it's the work of grassroots artists and organizers that has gotten us to this monument reckoning and reimagining. It's going to carry us through. So across the country, from Philadelphia to Montgomery, Alabama, St. Louis, to Rapid City, South Dakota, and of course here in LA. This was the first cohort, and we hope we're going to keep doing it. And I should say that we gathered this through an open call. We received applications from over 240 teams from every US state, most territories, numerous tribal communities. And just hearing how people in teams are imagining how they shift their own commemorative ecosystems. This is where that openness, the vagueness of what we sometimes mean by monument was actually value added. It was really beautiful to hear teams say, you know what, in my city or town, like the river is our central place of gathering, and that's where our history is held. Or, you know what, we have some statues, but we'd really like to invest in gathering stories and archives from our elders so that they are staying there in longer in perpetuity. And to think about this again as valuing local knowledge and expertise and building strategy and coalition elsewhere. This is a project that has in some ways wrapped. It's going to be a book soon, working on that, but hopefully it will continue. And whether it's here in LA or any of these other cities, these are great places to dive in. If you have that question of what comes next, look no further than the regeneration teams. Some of this, just doting on and appreciating the innovation in the work, and thinking about this both, again, as hyper-local and part of this national movement and national story, transnational at that. I want to share just a few moments of, like, for me, learning and growing. Before we embarked on this project, we brought team leaders around the country to Washington, DC. We held a summit. It sounds really official to hold a summit. We didn't go to the summit committee. We didn't go to the summit think tank. We just said, let's call it a summit, and that will sound good. We worked connections, conversations that we had with several federal agencies to try to host a delegation on the National Mall. The National Mall is a symbolic core of this country. It's an invented place, as the scholar Laurette Savoy has said, because it's built on fill. It's where the Potomac River and river systems used to run, which were filled in order to make a capital. We wanted to imagine this dream delegation. What if there was an agency out there that convened the leaders of the monument movement? And so we wanted to see that. We built that and it was powerful to see. And I love on the left, Michelle Browder from Montgomery, Alabama's Moore campus, taking a penny up to the Lincoln Memorial statue to kind of scale it for size. Like, if you don't have the ability to actually scale a monument to the human level, what are the tactics of art and design that work with scale to at least shift perspective? Here on the left, including Mercedes Dorame from Landon and the Plinth, Amy Salze from the Rapid City Indian Boarding Schools Project, and Cassie St. John from Walking with Dine Ta, three Indigenous leaders looking outward on the mall with the statue of Abraham Lincoln behind them. One of the wildest experiences was going under the Lincoln Memorial. Now, I haven't climbed up many monuments. I've been on top of a few. I've been under a few small pedestals. I have never in my life been under anything like the Lincoln Memorial. There is a visitor center that the Park Service is hoping to open in the next few years under, we got a tour with this delegation. You go down this iron wrought staircase and go into this place that kind of looks like a cathedral or a cave. There are drawings on the walls that were left there by the construction workers from 100 years ago. And the dirt floor, I asked very naively to our Park Service friend, I was like, oh, did you move this dirt in? And they're like, this is the riverbank of the Potomac. And that was just incredibly haunting. You look up and you can see above you where President Lincoln sits, and you look out and you see stalactites going down. And you see there is where moisture is actually just through small cracks getting in through the facade of the marble steps, which seem impenetrable, which seem like they've been there forever, that we know they're not. One of the stalactites that's forming, where we're pointing to and gathering here, when we asked the park ranger, what's going on above? This is the space where Dr. Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. It's where Marian Anderson, Black opera singer, sang in a segregated DC on the steps. It is where, by an act of Congress, Dr. King's name and words were carved into the marble. We're changing monuments every day, whether we see it or not, whether we have the time scale or perspective, whether we're given that knowing. It's a reminder for us that history doesn't live inside of statues. It lives with people. It lives with us. I'm going to close with just what will feel like a diversion, but I will say it's a point of learning for me. I've been working on my first podcast series with NPR called The Statue. And after studying, the monument landscape and looking across patterns, I was haunted and compelled by a monument in my hometown to the most famous Philadelphian who never lived, Rocky Balboa. If you've seen the Rocky series, or you know what I'm doing if I do this, I have been in Germany, I've been other places, and I'm asked from Philadelphia, and they say Rocky. 4 million people go to the Rocky statue every year. That Statue of Liberty numbers. And it's been kind of laughed at and looked upon as not real. And I have to say, I kind of rolled my eyes to it too. And it was my mother who kind of gave me a look once when I said, oh, I don't really pay attention to the Rocky statue. She's like, you got to go check it out. What I have learned in spending time at this site and trying to tell a story, one is that when it comes to podcasts, I've solved a lot of problems with my words. I'm trying to solve fewer problems with words and actually make room for a lot of other voices as well. Let's see if this works. I was interested in the fact that 4 million people come from all walks of life, across lines of race, gender, sexuality, class, national belonging. Around the line, I've met refugees from other countries who come to Philadelphia and find strength with Rocky. People doing harm reduction, anti-violence work, who connect with Rocky, and that feels extraordinary and worth it. Because think of all the monuments that we drive by, walk by, pass by every day, and they're faded, and this one always has activity. But of course, when any single monument gets a lot of attention, I wanted to know whose story is missing. And in one case through this podcast series, we've taken a look at the story of Joe Frazier, a real life boxing heavyweight champ from Philadelphia, who is the person who ran up the art museum steps and punched raw meat before the movie character Rocky did. And now there's a statue to him, and there's a street in his name, but he's not the one who's known around the world.
There's a statue to a mythical figure who represents the city, but there's no acknowledgement of an actual person who in many ways was truly the embodiment of an underdog story, right? So the fact is that this is someone who really never received the recognition that he deserved for his talents.
I'll close in a moment, and I'll call attention to a few things here. One, this has been an immense learning journey for me and my team. to be able to bring together what's happening in public spaces around this country, around this world, and really think about narrative change. How do you change the environment around you? How do you preserve in ways that are democratically inclined, reparatively inclined? And also how to make it in a way that invites people in the conversation and opens that up. The words you just heard were from our Monument Lab board member, Amari Johnson, who's a Temple University professor and was the first lab manager at our project. In this notion of monuments must change, I've been asked a few times, like, well, what do we do then with the Rocky statue? Do we keep it? Do we take it away? I have to tell you, I actually believe like it's important to take a look, not just at trying to fix this one thing and make the problem go away, but take a step back, understand how resourcing, spotlighting, and monuments happen, and how to understand what's going on around it. On the left, Joe Frazier's gym, which is now on the National Register, but is empty, and we look at it in the series, and thinking about it in conversation with the Rocky statue. And what does it mean to imagine possibilities for this to have new resonance? And of course, the steps themselves. These steps are places where, as a city in Philadelphia, we mourn, we protest, we parade. Every day it is active. We talk to folks who have held vigils there. Here's one vigil from 2020 in honor of Elijah McClain. And what I would just call for is, in this notion of monuments must change, is opening up the possibility that there isn't one single fix. We can't make the monument problem go away fast, just as we're responding to generations of hurt, of pain, of grief, of policy that has rendered symbols above us and frozen in time. So what if we take a step back in one sense and take a step forward to look at the ways that people every day utilize the monuments that they've inherited and aim to unearth the next generation of monuments. On that note, thank you.